But now on to our first guest. Professor Laura Lundy is co-director of the Centre for Children's Rights at Queen's University Belfast and Professor of Law in University College Cork. She is co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Children's Rights, and her expertise is in law and human rights with a particular focus on children's right to participate in decision-making. The Lundy model of children's participation is used extensively in practice and has been adopted by numerous national governments and public bodies and international organisations, including the European Commission, WHO and UNICEF. Laura, welcome to the ICOACHKIDS Conference.
Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone attending the conference, and thank you to ICOACHKIDS for the invitation to present. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about how to engage children in youth sport. As I said there, my background is in law and human rights, and particularly children's rights. And I think that most of you will be familiar with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. I can tell you that wherever you are in the world, unless you're in the United States, your country has ratified this convention, and that means that your government has agreed that it will obey by every provision in that convention. And if you're in the United States, I think you should know that actually the United States has a very strong history and tradition of protecting freedom of expression, including for children and young people. So this is the official UNICEF child-friendly version of the convention, and I have highlighted one particular provision, and that's Article 12. Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is summarized here for children as saying that they are entitled to respect for their views. And that's what I'm going to focus my talk on, Article 12.1. So this is the text of the provision, and you might have heard of the convention, and you might even have heard of this provision, but you probably won't be able to recite this particular article word for word. It's a complicated provision because it was a contested provision. But what it does is it says that states parties, who are all our governments, are required to ensure that a child who's capable of expressing a view is entitled to have that view given due weight in accordance with age and maturity. Okay, that's Article 12, and I'm going to focus on that in my talk. One of the most important things to know about Article 12 is that it's a standalone right. Children are entitled to be heard when they want to speak if they have a view on anything. But from a child rights or children and youth rights perspective, what's also really important is that it's considered to be a cross-cutting principle for all children's human rights. And what we know is that particularly in sport with children, there has been a lot of focus and attention on safeguarding and child protection in the wake of historic child abuse and concerns about keeping children safe. And I want to make one point about that because it's not the focus of my talk today. And the point I want to make is this: you cannot keep children safe unless you listen to them and you involve them. We know that across all domains of children's life. So children's right to be protected from harm in Article 19 needs us to be listening to them as in complying with Article 12. But I also want to say that there are a number of other children's human rights that are really relevant to coaching and to youth sport, in particular the right to play and leisure and rest, the right to health, the right to education, which focuses on physical development, and also the right to development itself. So what we know is you cannot deliver any of these substantive human rights unless you also deliver Article 12, that we seek children's views and we take them seriously. One final point before I start to talk about the Lundy model, and that is that what we know now, it was unclear at the start, is that this right applies both to individual and collective participation. What does that mean? It means that when decisions are made that affect only one child, an individual child, it applies, but also when decisions are made that are affecting groups of children, perhaps a team or perhaps a whole sport, that is also a right of groups of children. They are entitled to have their views sought and taken seriously. So examples of decisions that might affect individual children, this will depend very much on your own context, but we think of things like children's views on what position they play, whether they play at all, what sport they play. These are all individual decisions that are sometimes made for children and not with children. And Article 12 says that when these are happening, we should be checking in with children. What do they want? Why do they want it? What can we do or what can't we do? And then secondly, decisions affecting groups of children. And these decisions have a huge variety. This can actually mean something like national policy. We saw it during COVID, we're seeing during COVID, the initial lockdowns, children's sport was stopped. Children felt incredibly strongly about that. We know, we did a study on it. And that means what that means is that governments should be consulting children in national policy, for instance, during those lockdowns, about what they could do to ensure that children could still keep up with their sports. It could mean that it's actually just about team policies or club policies. I've already mentioned the safeguarding policy. Children should be involved wherever money is spent. If we're deciding where money is spent, can we give children their own budget? Not just about kit, although kit is really important, and also within their teams, perhaps within their teams about who's playing, when they're playing, which fixtures, which leagues. These are all decisions that are affecting them as a group, and they're entitled to be heard. So coming on to my journey, that's just a little bit of context about the idea that this is a human right. So for me, it goes back 17 years. And as I said, I'm a lawyer, and I was obviously familiar with the legal text of Article 12. But in a research study that I conducted then, and many research studies since, what I've realized is that what the text requires, what adults understand it to be, and what children experience can be three different things. So I'm going to talk about the text in a minute. But what adults understand often is, whenever I talk to adults in research projects or in practice, they will often say, well, yes, no, we do that. We listen to children. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, we do. The voice of the child is really important, in our practice. And then when we talk to children in the same context, what they tell us often is actually no one asks for their views. Whenever their views are asked for, that often nothing happens, or they aren't told what has happened to their views. Or if they aren't asked for their views and they offer their views, this is what I want, that sometimes they're considered to be being cheeky, to be challenging authority, and that can have negative consequences for them. So we had this disconnect, and we still have this disconnect between what the obligation is and what adults think they're doing and what children actually experience. And so this took me to where I came up with the Lundy model, although I didn't know it was going to be called that. And that is, I started to question this idea of the voice of the child and the various abbreviations that adults were using when they were delivering this human right, whether it was the voice of the child, the right to be heard, or the right to have a say. And I concluded that each of them was really an imperfect summary that could potentially undermine implementation of this important human right. And what I suggested then was that voice is not enough. We've really got to get past this idea of voice, or even engagement, which is the title of my talk. And that if we want to deliver this human right, that we have to have space, voice, audience, and influence. So in space, we have to create the conditions where children feel safe, that are inclusive. In voice, we have to facilitate children, not only to express themselves, but sometimes to come to a view. Audience, we need to know where their views are going, and that person needs to have authority to effect change. And finally, influence, that their views have to be given due weight as appropriate. Those are the four elements of the model. The most recent version of it, it's been used a lot, but the most recent version was one that I got to work on with the Irish government last year, largely during lockdown. And they have a national strategy on child and youth participation. So every government department has actions, lots of actions around sport and leisure. But also they now have a national framework. And this was developed with children and young people, but also with people out in practice, including those working in youth clubs and in sports clubs. And what they said is that if we're going to put the Lundy model into practice, what we need is an everyday spaces. We need a guidance, and we come up with this set of questions that you can ask around space, voice, audience, and influence. I'm not going to go into them in detail because you can get links to all of this. But for instance, it's really important in space that it's a safe space, that it's an inclusive space. We always need to be asking who's not talking, who's not in this conversation, and how do we get them in? In voice, we have to work with understanding. Do they understand the issues? Can we give them choices? Because they might not have a view until they've time to form one. Audience, as I've mentioned, is about really ensuring that you're giving children the impression that you are taking them seriously, and often adults don't. And they do that often because they rush away or they don't take the time. And then influence, understanding what actually happens to views. And I'm going to come back to that one. That's in this national strategy, there's an example of being used for national policy. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but one of the things that I really like in these checklists is the emphasis, which came from staff and children, is that you must allow sufficient time Time is really important to children and young people. And the final tool that's in that checklist is as a little tool designed by children themselves, which can be used to check if they felt heard. And all of these tools, the Irish government has been very generous, and everyone can pick them and adapt them in their own context. So I just want to show 2 examples of them being used, a kind of cascading down from the national strategy. And Sheila Quinn spoke earlier, and this is part of her work. This is from Sports Ireland. And I really like this guide that they have put together, because what happens with the Lundy model is people are able to take it and make it their own. And I really like in this guide, there are lots of practical tips for how to do this through votes and polls with children in clubs and sports. But it acknowledges the context of youth sport, which is often very hierarchical. And that's not, sport's not the only place to be hierarchical, but we need to acknowledge that there are cultures where children are listened to, and there are cultures where it's harder. And I'm sure that varies by sport. I don't know all of that, but I'm sure you do yourselves. And I just like the fact that it's acknowledging that and saying, well, what actually can be done? And again, this guide emphasizes time. Another just specific example from Ireland is this flown down from the national strategy, comes from Swim Ireland. And again, there's Swim Ireland making it their own, in terms of the model. They're looking at where does it happen? And actually in Swim Ireland, it could be happening poolside, it could be happening inside, it could be happening outside. And you can see that in this guide, they're looking at the circumstances, the space and the opportunities, and they're trying to make it feasible for themselves to engage with the children whom they coach. Okay, so how do we get, this is the ultimate holy grail of child participation, youth engagement. How do we make sure there's influence? This is what children tell us. My views were taken, but I don't know what happened to them. And in my latest work, I've been emphasizing how important it is that there is feedback, and not just any old feedback, that we give children really detailed, fast, full, friendly, and followed up feedback. And I'm particularly interested in what's full. And in full, I've suggested that whenever you've taken children's views, take the time then to tell them what has happened, what you agreed with, what surprised you, why did it surprise you, what are you going to do, what are you not going to do? Crucially, if you cannot do it, explain to children and young people why it's not possible. Is it money? Is it time? Is it resource? Is it a safety issue? Because often they don't understand, they just know they wanted this and it didn't happen, and that can be frustrating and disappointing and can put them off. So feedback is crucial. It's a critical juncture in a participatory dialogue. When you're engaging in young people, it's that follow-up accountability, which is the heart of all human rights. Final example from practice then is that, this is a really lovely example from England. It's Salisbury Rovers Football Club. They've been doing amazing work. And what I really love about their work is they have grounded this not just in Article 12, but in a full child rights process. And what they are doing is really engaging with the right to have a say, the right to be heard in Article 12, along with their play and their leisure. They have lots of child-led activities. They have lots of children, very young children, really inclusive of very young children, direct to the kind of training and coaching they want in football, which might actually be football golf. And they have a great website which has lots of videos showing what they do. And I strongly commend it to you as an example of good practice. So finally, and this is my final slide, when you talk about youth participation in sport, it's often about taking part, as Sheila said, and you've got this concern that they're stopping taking part. And Sheila made the strong argument that, what can we do to stop children stopping doing sport? And of course, one way to do that is to find out what's going to keep them there and what's putting them off. And you can only do that by engaging with them. And if you're going to have that kind of child participation, it has to be participation with purpose. This is what the Irish strategy is based on. And that means you're actually talking to them, not just for the sake of it, but with the absolute intention, whether that's one individual child, the team, the club, or the national policy. It's actually to bring about change and to engage children's views in that, to shape the sport that they want to do. Because they have a right to be heard on all matters affecting them. And we know that sports and their clubs really, really matter to them. So thank you very much for that. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Laura, thank you so much for your insights. And 15 minutes is never quite enough to just get our teeth into just how amazing this model is. So thank you for sharing that with us. We have some questions from our audience, and we've got time for a couple. One of the questions that have been asked is, what seem to be the biggest barriers for the voice of children and young people to be heard in general and specifically in sport?
So I think I just touched on it there, and I picked it up, not that I know this, but I picked it up from reading around for this presentation. Biggest barrier generally is often a culture where we don't actually engage with children, that it's just not been a done thing. It's been if there's been a context where adults make decisions and are used to making decisions and think they know best, and often they do know best. What a rights-based approach is not about is handing over decision making to children, unless that's the right thing to do in a particular instance. It's ensuring that decisions are made in a joint dialogue. And all human rights come from the idea that we all have the right to dignity, equality, and respect for our worth. And it's making sure that adults start to see the child in the team or the child they're coaching as this human being entitled to dignity, respect, and worth. And that means self-determination. You know, none of us would accept being told in our sports what we could or couldn't do. And we're building children's capacity to make, you know, good decisions. And we can only do that by starting to ask them what they want, engaging with them, doing what they want, or when we're not doing what they want, then explaining to them why we cannot. But it's always about involving that and changing that culture where adults decide and then tell children, this is what's going to happen.
And I wonder, when we start to talk about things like the child gaining autonomy, that are there many instances where at first the child will almost repeat what the adult says in order to give them what they think they want to hear, and as such, does time equally apply to the adult as well in terms of being patient with slowly scaffolding an appropriate environment?
Gary, that's a great way of putting it. And again, that's not just, you know, unique to sport. That happens everywhere. And sometimes children will want to please. I mean, they love their coaches, they respect them, they will want to please them and do what they're suggesting. So I think it requires the skill set and mindset to come to the child and say, well, you have choices here. Here's some choices. We could do A or B or C. Here's the advantages and disadvantages. This might work, might not work. And then letting children gradually make more and more choices, maybe to the point where they're actually have quite a lot of autonomy later on within their own clubs or their sports or their decision making. But you're right, scaffolding is a good way to describe it. And it fits with a rights-based approach, which is building their capacity to understand the issues as well.